What's up, people? This is Ajax, and this is episode 4 of the Golden Age of Broscience podcast. So before I introduce our guest for today, I'll make a quick note of not podcast sponsors. This is an unsponsored podcast, but products, companies I like. If you are a bro scientist into biochemistry, you're into peptides, Elite Research USA, they are my preferred vendor. You can use code 10AJAC, AJC for 10% off. If you want to spend some money on a big purchase, I love my infrared sauna. I've had 3 years. I've talked about it many, many times. I don't need to expound on why saunas are good for you. But check out High Tech Health. Call them on the phone. Say Ajax sent you. They'll give you a deal on a new sauna. All that said, let's get to the guest. I've got Zaid. I just realized I'm going to screw up your last name. Pronounce your name, everyone, bro.
So first name Zaid, last name Dahhaj.
Zaid Dahhaj. Okay, there we go. So Zaid, this is our first time talking, brother. I know that I think you've followed me a while. You've said it before, like since 2018, approximately.
Yeah, I mean, 2017, 2018 Periscope days, whenever you were doing the Periscopes for sure.
Yeah, that's when I was doing like a daily Periscope a day. I really just like talking direct to whoever my audience was at the time. That was really fun. Obviously, Periscope doesn't exist anymore. And then I know that you got heavy into circadian health, circadian science the last so many years. Like you've become the man for that. Like from when I first saw your content, if you started posting regularly to now, it's been like a big shift where you've clearly developed probably like a world-class set of expertise and tools, and you're working with clients, and which has been really cool to see. But yeah, you just tell us the story, brother. Like obviously you went from, you're a young guy, you got into sunlight, photobiology. Like what was the story?
Well, for me, I mean, I've always had some interest in health because of the fact that I started playing soccer competitively at the age of 4. I essentially caught the bug because of my father's influence through that game. And I spent the next 20 to 22 years pursuing that game and trying to go professionally as many other people do. Of course, it's very difficult. There's a lot of ups and downs. But, I went to various countries, Costa Rica, England, Ireland, so forth, to try to pursue a pro contract. It didn't end up working out in the way that I wanted to, but I think that led me down a very specific path in which, it led me here, ultimately to circadian biology and the study of circadian principles. But the real pivotal moment for me was when my father had 2 heart attacks within the span of a year. So while I was in England trying to pursue this goal for me, this lifelong childhood goal, he ended up having a second heart attack, which was a widowmaker, so myocardial infarction. And that's really what led me down into this more obsessive approach to holistic health. And, of course, we go down the rabbit holes of nutrition and supplementation and all this other stuff. But eventually, a few years after that experience, I found circadian biology. And most notably through the work of Dr. Jack Kruse. A lot of people find this work through him. But I just decided that this made sense to me. It resonated with me. And I felt like it was a definite root cause approach to systemic health. And so from that point forward, I just started to make content on it, learn about it obsessively, work with clients progressively. And then from there, it's taken on a life of its own.
So just to recap and clarify one thing, you said your dad, he had 2 heart attacks within a span of how many years?
2 years.
2 years. Okay, 2 heart attacks in 2 years. Second one being the widowmaker heart attack. And then I was unclear, did he pass away from that, or has he made a recovery, or?
Yeah, so second heart attack put him into a coma, which eventually led to his passing.
Okay.
So that's why I often say that it was definitely the toughest experience of my life, but it was also a blessing in a real way because it led me down this specific path, and people kind of find that to be contradictory. But I do think that every sort of negative event like that holds some potential if you have the right mindset.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the traumatic events can be obviously transformative if you direct that sort of raw energy somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, I think that's I think that also helps me when it comes to working with clients and just trying to understand the everyday person when it comes to this work, because a lot of people in their minds, they look at circadian biology and all the science and they just get way too overwhelmed and just discount it and throw it to the side. But that kind of experience, I think, has developed a lot more empathy for me, for other people, as well as, people in my immediate vicinity who don't really understand my work, but who are kind of mired into the centralized narrative around sunlight and sunscreen and all this other stuff.
Gotcha. So talking about like the complexity of photobiology, circadian rhythm, there's a simple version, which is everyone needs to get outside more. It's like very easy to say. It's like go outside. Okay. Like, what are we actually trying to improve? For yourself, you discovered Jack Kruse's work. How did you approach learning about it, and how did you mentally organize it? Like using first principles.
It's a good question. I don't think I had like a very systematic way of going about it. I think it was just more so just finding different subsections within the actual area of circadian biology and then going down those rabbit holes. And so for me, like if I learned about like opsins, non-visual photoreceptors, or mitochondria and how they interact with light, it was a very spontaneous process to where I would, go through the research, understand what various figures like Kruse would say or other people in the industry. And for me, I think that's how I basically added to my epistemology over time. So again, a very spontaneous process. I definitely take a lot of notes. And so for me, Notion has always been a very important part of this work because I can add to whatever I've built on epistemologically, from previous efforts.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's a big part of it, not really going down into other podcasts per se, but trying to find books to study this work. But ultimately, I think using a lot of the literature is very helpful for me because I am more scientifically minded as well.
Is there a formative book or like a resource? Like if someone wanted to start learning about this today, like at a deeper level, and it's like, okay, where do I start? Like, where would you direct them to?
It's difficult because I don't think there is one book that can explain a lot of this comprehensively, because ultimately there's a lot of dot connecting that needs to be done. And so I would say I would tell the more scientifically minded, people who are interested in biophysics and that stuff to go to Kruse's work. But I don't think he really explains a lot of it in a simple manner. And that's the difficult part for the average person, right? So I mean, honestly, I'd be selfish and just say, go to my Substack, go to my Twitter, my Instagram, because I really do feel like I have a kind of a specialty in my ability to kind of simplify a lot of the complex science subjects here. And so for me, there are also other books like, I believe John Ott wrote a couple books. Fritz Hollwich has a book out. He was a German ophthalmologist in the early 1900s. You have the work of Auguste Rollier or Niels Ryberg-Finsen. These are all like profound characters within the space that I think can help people kind of put together the historical context involved.
No, those are good suggestions. Since, like, I always try to approach things from like what gets called, first principle systems-based thinking. If you're trying to distill something down to like the simplest possible explanation or mechanism or part, and then you start building up on it. But with circadian rhythm, like you can approach it from so many different ways. And then, when you dive into it even a little bit, you realize that everything's affected by light. It's like you can name any system in the body and it's going to have some connection, with your light exposure, with your regulation that way. So that, trying to make suggestions based off that, or just trying to understand it, like what's actually happening when we do go outside. Like, is that worth trying to explain? Now, how do you approach it with clients when you work with people?
I just ultimately like to start with the basics. I mean, I don't think I need to explain any of the scientific stuff to them because you're more likely to lose somebody by doing that. For me, I start with the very lifestyle basics and, just throw in a few nuggets in terms of like how amazing the human body is in terms of its circadian mechanisms. So, if somebody starts to talk to me about, or if I start to talk to somebody about making it dark after sunset, for example, then that's where I would just throw in something like, look, did you know that your skin contains non-visual photoreceptors? In other words, light-sensing proteins that are designed to pick up on various wavelengths of light. So kind of approaching it in that fashion has really been successful for me. And of course, you adapt it to the individual client. Some people are they're way deep into the biohacker space. Other people don't give a shit about the science and they would more likely just be given the circadian protocols. So it just depends on the individual. But I think that I think you need to marry the circadian principles and the practical applications with some of the science. Because if you don't, in my mind, you do actually lose out on a lot of the magic. And there is potential for the individual to lose out on the sustainability factor involved here.
So, I mean, if you were to sort of teach the principles, let's say, you almost college professor style, like you're going to teach the principles, you're going to combine it with the science. Like, what does that sort of curriculum look like?
Well, I would say it looks, I mean, we have to start with the light and dark cycle, this natural duality, this coupled system between bright days under full spectrum sunlight and then dark nights using minimal circadian friendly lighting. That's foundational. And then that I think funnels into the various things like watching sunrise, UVA rise, taking a progressive overload approach and framework to midday sunbathing, along with the other stuff during nighttime. And then from there, I think, just trying to explain the basic circadian mechanisms involved. Like you have the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which is the master circadian clock, fundamentally influenced by light. And then you have all of the peripheral clocks that are attached to every organ, protein, cell in the body. And so I think kind of explaining it in that manner helps. And then, we can go down into like opsins and how mitochondria are connected to light, how chronic disease is intricately tied to the circadian mechanism and why, I think modern society creates sort of this chronic disease epidemic because of circadian disruption and other factors. But either way, I think it's definitely about this kind of synergy between understanding the circadian principles and then the science as well.
Just to recap that, so we have a suprachiasmatic clock in the brain, which is sort of like the master clock. And we have the peripheral clocks throughout the body. So I guess to ask a fundamental question, since I'm familiar with circadian science, maybe not all listeners are, but why does the human body need light? Like what makes that actually essential for our biology?
I mean, there are many angles where this can be answered from, but I think, if we take the evolutionary lens, it just makes sense that we are a circadian diurnal species, diurnal meaning we're supposed to be awake during the day and asleep during the night. And so from the evolutionary lens, it makes complete sense why full spectrum sunlight can be viewed as kind of a quote unquote nutrient for the body. And I think it's fundamental from that perspective. But even, if you go down to the smallest aspects of your cells, the mitochondria, you have trillions of mitochondria within the system. And so these mitochondria are inextricably tied to circadian mechanisms. They are under circadian control. Even more to that point, they are also designed to take in a full spectrum of sunlight. And they're also electromagnetically controlled. So, that's just another layer to add to this discussion. But I think if you look at the human body from that evolutionary context, then it becomes clear that every aspect of the human body is designed to work with full spectrum sunlight, as opposed to more of the modern manifestations like altered spectrums through low emission glass, or, we can talk about sunscreen, sunglasses, all that other stuff. So it just makes a lot of sense when we understand that evolutionary and circadian underpinning.
So going back to the mitochondria being inside the cells, the mitochondria themselves, if we take sort of like a protobiology perspective, so at some point in human evolution, assuming you subscribe to human evolution or evolution in general, you had your eukaryotic cells, you have mitochondria, which at one time were their own sort of separate organism, and they were dependent upon light to function. They get absorbed, they become synergistic with a larger cell. Now they become the powerhouse / the motherboard cell. They still need light to function. And that eukaryotic cell also needs light to function. So even though it's sort of like the smallest sort of unit of life of a living system, going back 4 billion years, sunlight was still essential. Light exposure was still essential. Is that accurate to say?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's not just about the physical as well. I think that obviously it plays a fundamental role in the physical health of a human being and all other, animals on this planet. But there's also a huge philosophical play to this as well. I mean, if you look through every major religion, you'd be hard pressed to find a religion that doesn't talk about sunlight or doesn't at the very least talk about the light and dark cycle as an integral part of its philosophy. And so for me, I think that's also an important factor, because at any level, we can look at reality and we can find that sunlight or the light and dark cycle is, a part of humanity that we cannot ignore, a part of existence we cannot ignore. So building off of that logic, I think that it's completely and utterly ridiculous for mainstream medicine to kind of demonize full spectrum sunlight, more specifically UV. And that's something that, that's a rabbit hole in and of itself that we can talk about. But any way you look at it, I mean, it's just absolutely essential.
No, let's talk about that, because I remember I had a series of posts. This was, I want to say 2020, I think. So during COVID era, I was in Thailand. I was in the sun a lot. And that was obviously a strange year. for many reasons. But I was tanning a lot, and then I was never a sunscreen wearer at all. It intuitively felt strange, even as a kid. I hated wearing sunscreen. But I was casually looking through statistics on skin cancer. Because then people were telling me, like, can you put sunscreen on? I'm like, I don't wear sunscreen. And you always get told the same thing. You're going to get cancer. It's like, why don't you wear sunscreen? You're going to age. I'm like, I don't believe that narrative. But I was looking at the statistics around sunscreen usage with skin cancer. And you can always argue about the statistics. Stats only go back so far in history, obviously. Because of modern methods of obviously polling, getting data. But what was interesting to me is that you look at the rates of skin cancer and the rate of sunscreen, and skin cancer has gone up in lockstep with sunscreen usage. So the more sunscreen we have used, the more skin cancer we get. But then you also have the studies that will hypothetically say, well, the more sunscreen you use, the less you get skin cancer. And the reason why everyone's getting skin cancer is because they don't use sunscreen. Which I'm like, that's really bizarre. Like, the more you use something, obviously, the more you get the cancer. But then you're being told that you're getting cancer because you're not using it. Yet prior to the introduction of sunscreen, skin cancer has a very low diagnosis rate. Maybe it was because of a lack of diagnosis. That's always possible. But it's the two charts just go up. It's like basically a horizontal. It's like a 45-degree line. It just goes straight up and it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
But I've seen you get into battles with dermatologists on your Substack, Instagram, what have you. But how do you explain it to dermatologists? Like, how do you basically write a whole new narrative of like, here's why light is good. Here's why UV light is not bad. Like, where do you start with that?
I have to inevitably start with circadian biology because I think it's kind of the bridge between this distinction between centralized medicine and decentralized medicine in relation to sunlight more specifically. So for me, that you have to explain so many different things within the realm of circadian biology to where you have to even get people started. Like, a lot of these medical professionals, arguably most, are not educated in circadian mechanisms and principles within their medical curriculum. So off the bat, there's this massive uphill battle to kind of face. And it becomes very difficult when you go online and try to argue these points with people because they just don't have the foundational epistemology to work with. So there are various things that we can bring up, but I think that's where the education comes in most importantly. And, I've had many doctors and many MDs, practitioners follow my work and tell me that they did not know about circadian biology. And this is news to them, which is pretty shocking, but I think it makes sense considering the history of modern medicine. You go back to the Flexner report with J.D. Rockefeller, Abraham Flexner, Andrew Carnegie, and that has really centralized medicine to a point where it's created these sort of guardrails for practitioners to follow in terms of their line of thinking. And so, again, it's just such it can be a shit show at times, but I think just the education from the circadian perspective helps a lot because it opens the door for these practitioners. And, with the whole sunscreen and skin cancer debate, that's something where I think there's a lack of informed consent. I do think a lot of the centralized recommendations are iatrogenic in nature. For people who don't know, iatrogenesis essentially refers to harm that is done to the individual based off of the recommendation of a medical professional, whether it's a surgery somebody doesn't need or sunscreen, in my opinion, because they're not taught circadian principles and how to actually sunbathe properly. But either way, we can riff off of that, but it's a lot.
So how does someone sunbathe properly? Like, I've heard describe this to people, and correct me, wherever the gaps are, where my premise for why I think skin cancer does occur in many cases, despite sunscreen usage, is you have a situation where people don't get much natural light throughout the year. They're not going outside in the sun in the morning, regardless of climate or where they live geographically. They're not going outside in the morning. They don't have any kind of solar callus / base tan or anything. They're just predominantly inside. And then summer arrives, and people want to go outside. But then they overexpose themselves. A very classical situation. I was in the sun too much. I got sunburned. Went to the beach, whatever. Outside 3 or 4 hours, got sunburned. They apply sunscreen, which blocks out some spectrums of light, obviously. But then they stay out longer because they're wearing the sunscreen.
It's an absolute perfect. In my opinion, it is a perfect recipe to at least gain some sort of negative consequence, right? And my philosophy is more so that it's the underexposure to full spectrum sunlight and the lack of adaptation, in addition to the circadian disruption that happens chronically, that eventually leads to the potential risk of a cancer, especially skin cancer. Because ultimately, when we look at the human body, and I've written about this in the past, all anti-cancer defense systems are under circadian control, which means that full spectrum sunlight, when you get it in circadian alignment, actually optimizes those anti-cancer defense systems to prevent you from getting cancer. And so, again, there are a lot of glaring contradictions within the mainstream narrative that I can point out. But we have to consider things like autophagy, apoptosis, senescence, DNA repair cycles. All that stuff is under circadian control. And so if you have somebody who spends 90 to 95% of their time indoors, meaning they're vitamin D3 deficient, anti-cancer, they're deficient in both forms of melatonin because they don't go outside during the day and they don't get darkness at night. Fundamental, like one of the most powerful anti-cancer compounds known to man, arguably even more potent than vitamin D3. You have altered spectrums of light through low emission glass, meaning you have this basically concentration of isolated UVA and UVB, which is a very destructive combination if it's not paired with red and infrared as nature and evolutionary adaptation created. Then you really set the stage for a skyrocketing risk of increased cancer development. And I think that's the big problem that many people don't understand. And again, it all funnels back to the fact that people are not educated in circadian biology.
You said something about melatonin, how there's two types. Expand on that.
Yeah, so you have the subcellular form, which is made from the mitochondria. That is produced during the daytime in response to near-infrared light. So if you go outside in just anywhere really, and you open yourself up to being outside, you're going to get some form of infrared. I mean, it absolutely bathes the external environment, especially in nature. And then on the back end of that, you have the circulatory form, which is produced from the pineal gland, and that responds to darkness. And so you can see how both forms of melatonin are basically married to the light and dark cycle. And ultimately, all hormones in the body are circadian in nature, so it only makes sense. And if you put yourself in a position of being the average person and not getting enough of that near-infrared light during the day, not getting enough of that darkness at night, then you basically set the stage for chronic deficiency in both forms of melatonin. And, you go through the literature on melatonin, it's anti-cancer, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. It's one of those powerhouses that we can't ignore, and that, shockingly enough, most mainstream medical professionals, especially the dermatologists, don't even focus on at all.
So with oral melatonin, so obviously you can take it in a capsule form or like a tablet. Is that form modeled on the pineal melatonin or the mitochondrial?
I'm going to assume it's formed on the pineal because most of mainstream medicine orients itself around the pineal form. Many practitioners actually don't know about the subcellular form yet because it's relatively new science. I believe there was a paper by Scott Zimmerman and Russell J. Ryder, maybe even within the past couple of years, that talked about melatonin and the optics of the human body. And they actually went to show that they want to distinguish between these two forms. And even more to that point, this is, I think, what's really shocking, is that 95% of the melatonin you produce in your body comes from the subcellular, the daytime form, whereas only 5% comes from the circulatory form. So it kind of flips the mainstream narrative on its head, which says that most of it comes from the nighttime form, when it's the complete opposite, actually.
Huh. I remember there was a book I read by there's a melatonin breakthrough. It was two authors. One of the guys was Russell Ryder, I think.
Yep.
And another guy, I forget his name. But the book's from it's from the mid 1990s. But like it argued the book advocates where melatonin combats aging, boosts the immune system, reduces risk of heart disease, better night's sleep. It does all these things. But one of the things it's advocated, which I don't know if it's probably dated now, but it's taking like high doses of melatonin at night because there's no defined upper limit of melatonin. There's no RD 50 level of like, oh, if you take too much you'll die, where you can take, I think the book recommended anywhere from like 10, 20, 40, 50, 100 milligrams of melatonin daily, which I've never taken that much. I've taken 50 to 60 at once, not chronically, like, this sort of like more a few days in a row. you do have an incredible sleep. Now, I'm sure some people would take that and they feel like they were drugged.
Yeah,
But
for sure.
I did find it interesting where I'm like, oh, like nothing bad happened. And in the bodybuilding world, I have known some guys where they'll take it while they're dieting because they'll have these really deep sleeps that they say, according to them, like helps with body fat loss. Now, obviously, this is not a widespread practice. I'm not recommending anyone go out and take 50 milligrams of melatonin tonight. But it was just interesting. And it's like melatonin, it seemed like 30 years ago had something of like a sort of mainstream, what do you want to call it, like sort of mainstream hype around it for health. And then now it's just known as like a sleep aid that people say not to take or don't take too much or it's bad for you. But like I myself, I didn't realize there were different forms. Like I've only heard of the pineal form, pineal gland, melatonin comes from pineal gland. But the mitochondrial form is what everyone's probably like deficient in, not the pineal one.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because I think it also ties into how centralized medicine or mainstream medicine, for people who don't know about the term centralized and what we mean, it has this very reductive view of biology. And so it inevitably misses out on so much and it leaves so much on the table, to where I think that doctors and practitioners and even just everyday layman people, like they're just not educated from a comprehensive perspective. And that, I think, is the real battleground, because if you look at biological systems and the human body, it operates on holism. It doesn't operate on reductionism. We can try to understand some things through a reductionist lens, but for us to act like we understand the full scope of how this is all working through that lens is just foolish. It's absolute hubris in my mind. And so, yeah, it's very important to just go outside under shade to get that near infrared light during the day. Even opening the windows has a massive effect, whether you're in the car or inside. And then during the nighttime, really maximizing that darkness and making sure to use a few bits of incandescent lights or firelight. All that stuff is really integral to all of this work.
Mm. With light exposure, since like a common thing, like a common, I think, maybe like protest people have, or like a obstacle, is they can't go outside necessarily and get naked. Like, their assumption is with light exposure, like you have to be sort of this, minimal clothing, no clothing if possible. And that's the only way you're going to get sufficient sort of like solar stimulus. But in actuality, like the light, certain spectrums of light, they're still going to penetrate through even clothing, through the skin. You don't necessarily have to be in the nude and be sunbathing to get the benefits.
Oh yeah, and we're specifically talking about the longer wavelengths. So red, infrared, near infrared, far infrared, that stuff makes it through. I think I forgot what number of layers, but a substantial amount of layers. Like you could be wearing a jacket and those longer wavelengths would still be penetrating through into your body and actually through your body. They can be measured on the back end as well. I think the work of Dr. Roger Sayholt is really good for that. Mm-hmm. But I think it is important to get most of your skin in the game, so to speak, for UVA and UVB. Because if we're talking about building melanin, if we're talking about true sunbathing according to the practice, that's where I think you do have to get the larger body parts exposed: chest, trunk, legs, back, all that stuff. And that's going to be very important going forward, because ultimately we want to look to build more melanin, and we want to get a pretty even tan as much as we can. Now, for some people, they can't do that. That's where I just recommend, just go outside. You're going to get some incredible benefit from longer wavelengths. But I think, yeah, that's a really comprehensive way to kind of view it with all of the wavelengths involved.
So now I'm sure this might differentiate depending upon ethnicity. How much sunlight do you suggest people get? Like, what's the ideal daily schedule look like?
It's hard for me to give a general for amount of time. I think for darker skinned people, they certainly need to get more, at least an hour a day. For lighter skinned people, I mean, I could recommend like 15 to 20 minutes a day at the very least. That will depend on somebody's case. If you have a redhead who burns very easily, I mean, they have to start with like 1 or 2 minutes, or maybe even 5 minutes. They're going to have to kind of test the waters on that end. And then if you have somebody who has like hyperpigmentation, hypopigmentation, melasma, they might have to start out with 1 to 2 minutes of that UVA and UVB combination. Mm-hmm. But I think the real magic in this work when it comes to circadian biology is the morning time, because the morning time is where you prime the skin in the same way that you warm up for a training session. This is where I bring in analogies like progressive overload, hormesis, melanin memory, in the same way that you have muscle memory. So the morning time is really a systemic warm-up for the skin barrier along with the entire system.
Mhm.
And, not only do those longer wavelengths like red and infrared provide an SPF factor, SPF of around 15 for the skin barrier, meaning it's meant to prepare itself for upcoming UV. But, red and infrared will also stimulate collagen, elastin, hyaluronic acid in the skin, youthful components of the skin barrier. And it will also produce filigrin and uricanic acid, which are basically skin proteins that moisturize the skin and are inherently protective of that barrier. And so, from any angle we look at it, really that morning time sunbathing is what we're really looking to do as much as we can to prepare ourselves, especially if you're lighter skinned or if you're somebody who's dealing with any of these sort of manifestations with the skin barrier.
Okay, I'll recap that. That's super useful because, like, again, I know most people's sun exposure, they tend to go out. Like, again, I'll use the beach stereotype example. They go to the beach, it's summer. They go to the beach in the hottest part of the day, or they go outside during the hottest part of the day, or the peak sunlight past 12 o'clock. Most people don't go outside in the morning specifically. So if you're going to sort of improperly expose yourself, if you go out at the most damaging time, essentially, they don't do any kind of proper warm-up, is what you're saying, to even prepare themselves for that level of intensity.
Exactly, because when we look at like how the solar spectrum changes over the course of the day, you have different wavelengths of light and different proportions of wavelengths. And I think from a circadian timing perspective, they all serve a very different very different role. And so the morning time, like I said, it's essentially a primer for the human body. It creates systemic circadian alignment in every organ, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, every tissue and cell in the body. But more importantly, it also primes and sets right the circadian skin clocks within the skin barrier. And so that's going to be very important going forward for people because it essentially gives you more leverage to be able to handle UVA and UVB when they're out. And following the kind of analogy with strength training or exercise, if you skip that warm up period and you go straight into intense exercise, which we're viewing UVA and UVB as those kind of external stressors, then you leave the door wide open for the likelihood of you experiencing some sort of side effect or injury. And that's really what we want to avoid because we want to have progressive overload, expose yourself to an external stressor, recover from it, and then repeat the process and get stronger. And you want to essentially enable this hormesis to happen because that's how the human body desires it. So, like, that's how the human body worked from an evolutionary standpoint.
That's a good analogy. So it would be, you start with morning sunlight for a period of time, and then your peak exposure would be obviously less than that. Yeah, I guess depending upon how hot the climate is. And then the evening light, like the dusk, which obviously it's less intense, then that's not necessarily for tanning purposes. Like, that's the other thing. People tend to think of light exposure like it's all about tanning, right? Just about melanin. Which, partially it is. Like, obviously melanin is probably one of the desired effects. But then, as you're saying, the different time zones that you're in throughout the day, each that's going to have a different impact on your overall regulation.
Exactly. And I think the nighttime is something that gets really misrepresented even within the circadian space because it's also very important to this whole process of tanning properly. So we have to kind of view the day as comprehensive as we can. And so when we talk about the nighttime, that's actually where the skin repairs itself comprehensively. From the epidermis to the hypodermis, the dermis, everything involved with the skin barrier is basically being completely regenerated and kind of fixed, quote unquote fixed, when you have darkness at night and when you go to sleep at an early enough time. And so this even ties into the tanning bit of the discussion because you have melanocytes, which are the cells designed to produce melanin. And lo and behold, those melanocytes are under circadian control, meaning they're designed to perform different roles at different times of day. And so if you have, let's say you're somebody who skips the morning time and you go straight into intense UV, and then you couple that with very bright light, isolated blue light at night, you mess up the function of those melanocytes completely over time, which then on the back end means you get this uneven pigmentation, you get weird things like melasma, hyperpigmentation. Of course, there are other things that contribute to that stuff, like hormonal changes and whatnot, but I think this is a part of the discussion that many people do not cover, even in the circadian space. It's a very fascinating rabbit hole for me.
So, with the role of melanocytes and melanin, just talk about that. Let's sort of like go deep just on that. So
So we have to understand that melanocytes are circadian controlled cells. So what you do on a day-to-day basis has a massive effect on them, just like any other cell, right? So in my mind, I think that we have to understand melanin comprehensively because mainstream medicine calls melanin a sign of DNA or skin damage, which is a very reductive, very kind of dead philosophy in my mind. It doesn't really explain anything, and it creates iatrogenic harm on the back end of that. When in reality, melanin is nature's most incredible biological polymer. It's found almost everywhere in nature. You have different forms. You have neuromelanin found in the brain of human beings. I think we're actually pretty unique in that sense, where we're the only species that has neuromelanin. You have eumelanin, responsible for the blacks and browns in nature. Think of like a gorilla or a black panther, brown dog. And then you have pheomelanin, which is the form of melanin responsible for the reds, yellows, oranges, and pinks in nature. So pink flamingo, red fox. If we were to distinguish human beings with these forms, eumelanin is basically what describes, African Americans or very dark colored Middle Eastern people. And then pheomelanin is where we find lighter skinned people. And so this is where we can describe the difference in tanning outcome or tanning color. So there's a reason why lighter skinned people do not tan black. There's a reason why darker skinned people do not tan in the same way that lighter skinned people do. So I think this gets very interesting because if we look at the scientific literature on melanin, it's fundamentally anti-inflammatory. It's actually anti-tumor, anti-cancer, which kind of contradicts the mainstream medicine narrative as well. It's able to remediate or detoxify heavy metal ions within the skin barrier. There's a whole bunch of benefits. It's radioprotective, meaning it protects against radiation. It is anti-venom, antimicrobial, antifungal. You go down the list. It's absolutely incredible. And so for me, I think we really want to build as much melanin as possible for that reason. Even to go deeper down that rabbit hole, I think that if you look at senses and how senses work, you can't have senses without melanin. Meaning between like your ability to sense, whether it be smell, taste, touch, that relies on the, intricate kind of electromagnetic ability of melanin to turn various forms of energy from full spectrum sunlight into usable forms of energy for the body. So it's one of those things that just makes sense considering evolutionary context, considering that melanin has been around since time immemorial. So for me, I love melanin absolutely, and I think we want to build as much of it as possible.
So I'm gonna make like a very reductionist, I think, not point, but just to like hopefully describe it further to the listener. So obviously, white people, dark people, darker people naturally have more melanin. Light skinned people have less melanin. Is that accurate or?
I would say it depends on the individual, but ultimately we're not looking at necessarily the amount, but the type in terms of how it's expressed in the skin.
Talk about the types. Just like go into the difference between like if you are black African American Congolese versus let's say Icelandic, like what is the actual sort of biochem or physical differences in skin?
I think the main difference, the one that's most worthy of being noted here, is the ability of it to block UV light and actually turn it into heat. I think that's the most important area here. So eumelanin is incredible in its ability to be photoprotective. It actually blocks 99.9% of UV light. And so it uses the rest systemically for various purposes. Whereas pheomelanin in lighter skinned people blocks around 20 to 40%, depending on what source you look at, but around 20 to 40%. And so this is why lighter skinned people are more susceptible to burns, initially at least. And this is why I think darker skinned people need a lot more sunlight, especially UV, because of the fact that they have this photoprotective system that is, unparalleled in nature. And that all ties into how somebody would essentially live their life from a circadian perspective, because it means, for somebody who's darker skinned in Seattle, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be something you need to consider over time. For lighter skinned people at the equator, let's say El Salvador or, Costa Rica, that's going to inform how you approach sunbathing, which means that you're going to have to be a lot more intentional about it because of the fact that pheomelanin is a lot less protective initially. But what I've found, at least from an anecdotal perspective and with working with people, is that you're able to build up a lot more melanin for sure. All mammals, in my opinion, can build more melanin. And you can get to a place where if you're lighter skin, you can basically avoid burns even with, multi-hour sessions in higher index UV light. And that to me is interesting because it tells us that we can develop that adaptation to go on and thrive with this work.
So pheomelanin, that's essentially, I want to say like the white form of melanin. That's like the lighter form of melanin. Yeah. From an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. If you're in an environment with like low UV light, less UV light, you need to be more sensitive to the effects of light. If you're in an environment with intense year-round sunlight, equatorial zone, you need more protection from it.
Exactly. I think lighter skin has developed over time to absorb more UV light to allow for more vitamin D3 production and all these other things. Whereas, they're just naturally, if your ancestry is from the equator, then you're inevitably going to have this photoprotective system of eumelanin to buffer that kind of high UV index environment and to be able to thrive with it as well.
Yeah, this is something that people don't often consider, like your ethnic origin, like where your people are actually from historically, or at least from for a very long period of time. That environment, that light environment, probably plays a role. But of course, it would play a role in overall health. Where if you have, let's say, like as you point out, environmental mismatch, you're a black guy living in Buffalo, New York, or if you're a white guy that's living on the equator, like it's really sunny, and maybe like being tan a lot, but like that's something that your ancestors were probably not exposed to. They didn't develop in that environmental biome too much at all, if at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think I have to tackle one idea, which is this concept that if a lighter skinned person goes about this work properly in circadian alignment, they're somehow increasing the risk of skin cancer and in negative outcomes. I don't believe that for 1 second, because again, we're going back to first principles biology. All anti-cancer defense systems are under circadian control. If you're somebody who's lighter skinned at the equator, you have more vitamin D3, you have a lot more vitamin D3. You certainly have a lot more endogenous melatonin. You're making it dark at night. I just don't see how you could make that statement understanding those first principles.
That's a good point. So, I mean, that's a common fear people have if they are. I've heard that for years from people. Like, I'm white, I'm Irish, or Scots Irish, whatever. It's like it, but like I hear you're telling me to go outside in the sun, but I always burn. Like, there's no way that's going to be good for me.
Yeah, the burning thing is very interesting. I think it's definitely a sign of whether you're adapted to full spectrum sunlight or not. And by the mere nature of how modern society has been created, literally people on average spend 90 to 95% of their time indoors. They go from the house to the car to the office. And so that leaves you open to burning because you haven't developed the adaptation of melanin through progressive overload and exposure to UV. And ultimately, if you look at chronic circadian disruption, how do you think that manifests? That manifests in the form of disrupted skin clocks, which then opens the door for burns. We have to consider that the eyes, brain, and skin are essentially one unit. That's referred to as neuroectoderm. And so considering that they're one circadian unit, whatever you do to impact the eyes in the form of wearing sunglasses will inevitably impact the brain and the skin, and then vice versa. So all of these things have to be taken into account.
Wait, expand on that. Neuro, I've never heard that term. Neuroectoderm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it essentially just explains that when you are an embryo in your mother's womb, those three things are made up of the same skin. And so as you develop from an embryological perspective and as you grow into a full-grown adult, there is an intricate connection to the eyes, skin, and the brain. They can't be disconnected. And so if you start to implement things that kind of go against circadian principles and biology, you create these second and third order consequences. Because ultimately, if we're talking about systems thinking, if you throw in a reckless input into the system, it creates a backfiring mechanism. And so from my perspective, I view sunglasses in most scenarios as one of those things that creates a backfiring mechanism. And then I view sunscreen the same way, tanning beds the same way because of isolated UV, low emission glass, altered spectrums. It's very interesting how we can find these connections through that. But yeah, we have to understand that those three things are one unit that needs to be in circadian alignment.
So I'm going to ask a series of questions off of this, and they're going to be some simplistic questions, but sunglasses. Like, so what makes sunglasses bad, potentially?
So we have to consider that the ocular system is a circadian organ, meaning you have melanin, mitochondria, non-visual photoreceptors within the eyes. And those things, all three of those things are light sensing mechanisms that are designed to absorb full spectrum sunlight. So for me, when you put on sunglasses, in most scenarios, I mean, if you have glare in the environment, sure, put your sunnies on, no problem, because glare does damage the eyes. But when you put sunglasses on, you're actually blocking the circadian signal of full spectrum sunlight. And so how does that actually manifest? Well, a great example is that when you put sunglasses on any time of the day outside, you're blocking these these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in your eyes from producing the things that they need to produce. And the interesting thing about those cells is that they actually produce they have melanopsin, which is the blue light sensor. And when you block that input from getting into the eye, sending a message to the brain, getting to the skin, you're essentially creating light sensitivity, because not only is melanopsin in those cells responsible for photoadaptation in the eye, but the dopamine that you produce from the retina in response to bright light also is responsible for photoadaptation. So you're basically blocking the very things that are responsible for allowing your eyes to sense and handle different light levels in the environment. And then there are other things. I mean, I think it opens you up to a higher susceptibility of burns because you're blocking alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. And the MSH family is responsible for producing melanin. So it makes sense that if you're blocking the very thing needed for photoprotection, you're gonna open yourself up to a burn. And then we also have to consider this part, is that if you look at the work of Professor Fritz Hollwich in the early 1900s, German ophthalmologist, he found that there's a direct endocrine connection to full spectrum sunlight into the eyes and in the overall body. And he found that, if you cut out cataracts from human beings, other species, he could actually manipulate cortisol, testosterone, epinephrine, all these things by the mere nature that cataracts actually block a substantial amount of full spectrum sunlight.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of history to it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Okay, so sunglasses, unless you are, like, I've never been a sunglass wearer myself. Again, it's one of those things that intuitively just seemed unnatural to me. Like, why do I, yeah, my dad's a physician. Yeah, he's from that generation of, like, if you're outside and it's bright, you got to wear sunglasses. I don't wear them. And I've seen sort of that older generation where they tend to have bad eyesight as they get older, which, yeah, part of it you could say, well, it's aging. It's like, yeah, but a lot of you guys, you love to wear sunglasses if it's really any time of day. If it's just like you're outside, you have to put sunglasses on. I've never worn them unless I'm driving in the car directly during, maybe sort of midday, and the sun is actually directly in your eyes. It's like, okay, I can't, it's hard to see, right? Otherwise, I would never wear
them. Use case for sure.
Yeah. So that's sunglasses. And then, so tanning beds. So I've gotten this question. I used tanning beds a lot in the past. I don't really use them at all anymore. What is your perspective on tanning beds? Good, bad, neutral, kind of bad, but maybe occasionally? Just go for it.
Yeah, as with anything, occasionally, whatever. I don't care. It doesn't have that big of an effect over time. I think the real I'm generally against tanning beds because of the fact that they provide isolated UV. Anything for me that provides isolated UV kind of breaks the hormetic system apart completely. Because if you look at how full spectrum sunlight is set up, you always have UV and blue paired with red and infrared. And in fact, only 3 to 5% of the sun's light is UV at ground level, which is pretty astonishing to think about, because what are the other aspects of the spectrum made of? And so if you go down that line of thinking, 42 to 45% of the sun's light is visible light, meaning red, blue, think of the rainbow. Think of red light therapy when we come to that aspect as well. And then the rest is actually made of infrared. 50 to 55% is infrared. So if you look through the literature, this is why I have a big problem with mainstream medicine when it comes to dermatology and skin cancer, all that, because they use isolated UV on nocturnal animals, often albino mice that are most susceptible to burns, or skin cell cultures, which just doesn't tell you anything about a circadian species that is directly married essentially to full spectrum sunlight. And so if you look through the real literature on this stuff, the stuff that's kind of harder to find, even the Journal of Dermatology has this. There's one study in particular that found that if you prime cells to near infrared light and you do it over a given set of sessions, maybe like 3 sessions, it eventually reduces or removes completely the cytotoxic or cell toxic effect of isolated UV. And so what does that tell us? That tells us that there's a synergistic effect between all light wavelengths, bar none. So for me, we have to understand that there is that synergistic impact. Modern medicine does not understand that because they don't study it with the light-right controls. And isolated UV is not the same thing as UV packaged within the full spectrum by the mere nature of that synergy.
So isolated UV. So like a tanning bed, obviously, it's not sunlight. It's the reason why you can only use tanning beds for a short period of time. It's super concentrated, obviously very high power. You stay in too long, you will burn bad.
Yeah.
As anyone, enough that I've used in the past, I never burned myself using tanning bed, but you do occasionally see those people who are like tanning bed addicts, usually like white women, where they're like, a natural color you would never be able to achieve even with sunlight. And they're super dark, and the skin's like very aged, like leathery. It almost probably is like armored itself up to handle being dosed with this stuff. So I guess, yeah. So, yeah, I'm probably never going to use tanning bed again after this conversation. But I was curious about that, since it's just, there's a convenience factor to it, obviously. But then, from seeing your work the past few years, I'm like, maybe this is just not good for me.
No, here's how we can make it a little bit better.
Yeah.
I think we can build upon this considering circadian principles. If you have a tanning bed that has UVA and UVB along with red and infrared, you dramatically reduce the risk of burns completely. And you actually, I think, improve outcomes systemically, especially with the skin barrier. Even more to that point, if you have to use a tanning bed with isolated UV, prime the skin for about 10 to 15 minutes with red and infrared prior, and then do it after. That, I think, is something that can help people, even if they're not getting the most ideal sunbathing from full spectrum sunlight. I think that's one of the ways where you can kind of use circadian principles to your advantage too.
Gotcha. So, I mean, to this point, like the dermatologists that warn against tanning beds, they're probably correct, though, about the tanning beds.
They're justified to a certain degree, absolutely.
Okay, gotcha. And then you'd mentioned a third thing, I think, was it melanotan? Or was it something else?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with melanotan, but what did I mention?
We said sunglasses, UV, tanning beds, and there was number 3.
I mean, there's sunscreen, and then there's yes,
as we talked about.
Yeah, sunscreen offers do you want me to go into sunscreen?
Yeah, let's do sunscreen. Let's go into it.
So for me, I think that it's problematic from many different perspectives. I mean, you have the fact that SPF is designed to block UVA and UVB more specifically. And what's crazy is that SPF blocks at least 90% of UVB. Wow. What do we know about UVB? It's the only light wavelength responsible for vitamin D3 production. So if you lather yourself in SPF, especially high SPF, you're not giving yourself the ability to produce vitamin D3 at all. If you are, it's going to be negligible amounts, which, big shocker. Why is everyone vitamin D3 deficient? And so that's one point. The next point is that with both mineral-based and chemical-based sunscreens, you have this problem of potential photocarcinogens. So things like avobenzone, oxybenzone, oxocrylene, in and of themselves, not really that big of a deal, in my opinion. But when you combine high heat, light, and high UV index environments, that's when you actually make this transformation to a photocarcinogen, which then completely disrupts the skin barrier. I mean, obviously, it's a carcinogen that's going to add to your risk of developing skin cancer and other cancers. But even more to that point, you have things like reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species in the skin. And the body is designed to produce ROS and RNS in very fine amounts. It's a very intricate system. But the moment you throw in those photocarcinogens, you essentially create this ROS and RNS runaway phenomenon to where the body can't handle it, which then essentially creates oxidative damage. And oxidative damage is a hallmark of cancer development. So very important to understand here. Outside of that, I think there is this problem of altering the full spectrum in the same way like low emission glass. So if you're blocking UVA and UVB, there's some sunscreen options that block infrared, which is just batshit crazy in my mind. What are you doing to the blue light? Most sunscreens are not touching blue light, which is, that is a high energy, shorter wavelength that does penetrate the skin. And so we're creating kind of these conditions to where there is potential for it to contribute to basal cell carcinoma or squamous cell carcinoma. So those are all things in my mind that are problematic. I mean, especially like the chemical-based ones are absolute garbage, destroy the coral reefs, destroy wildlife in the ocean. It's just a net negative in my mind.
Gotcha. That was a great explanation. So, like, how does, because I really don't know this. Like, I know SPF, the higher it goes, like, the stronger it is. Like, how does that scale actually work? Like, what is the difference between SPF 30 versus SPF 50?
I think SPF like lowest level, I don't know what the lowest level is, like 15, I think.
15.
Yeah, the lowest level is actually blocking 90% of UVB. So the higher you go, I think if you get to SPF 50, if there's anything even higher, you're talking about 98 to 90% of UVB being blocked, which is just insane considering that's the light wavelength range responsible for one of your most powerful anti-cancer hormones, essentially, that's being produced.
Yeah, on the question of vitamin D, so it's a common recommendation in medicine. Like having low vitamin D is not uncommon across many populations, like in blacks and South Asians, or darker people especially. They tend to get darker skin. They need more light, right? So then you see vitamin D3 get recommended. Like, okay, you got to take vitamin D3. What is the difference between the encapsulated D3 versus your actual endogenous vitamin D production?
If you look at the work of somebody by the name of Dr. Alexander Wunsch, I believe he's a photobiologist, but he talks about this difference, and he shows that if you look at exogenous, meaning supplemental vitamin D, that goes through a completely different transport route in the body than endogenous vitamin D3. So with endogenous vitamin D3, you have a few conversion steps. It starts with like 7-DHC, and then it eventually gets turned into pre-vitamin D and then D3. But the interesting thing is that endogenous vitamin D goes through the vitamin D binding protein route. That's how nature designed you to get vitamin D3. Whereas the exogenous or supplemental form goes through the lipoprotein route. And that's where you miss out on a whole bunch of effects. So, I mean, he talks about the differences in terms of like genetics as well and absorption rate and all that stuff. But what we have to understand is that vitamin D3 from the sun through UVB is essentially kind of like you have the correct email to be able to send the email to. Whereas the lipoprotein route through supplemental form, you don't have the correct email address. So it's not getting to all the exact places that it needs to go. And then I think that's also why, we can explain the fact that vitamin D3 supplementation doesn't necessarily show the same life extending or longevity benefits.
Yes, that's not to interrupt you. That's what I was getting at. Where, there's I follow lots of doctors, right? But one of the doctors I follow, he was talking about vitamin D. He's an Indian doctor based in India, in Kerala, and he was commenting that vitamin D levels, even if they're low, he was saying that based upon the literature we have, taking vitamin D, in vitamin form doesn't really seem to do anything. Like you can have low vitamin D and you can take vitamin D, but it doesn't have an effect. Which by his according to him, he's like, I don't think there's any real reason to take this. It isn't actually him to improve any of the low vitamin D conditions.
Yeah, I mean, and plus, like, you increase the risk of side effects when you take exogenous vitamin D3 because, you're opening yourself up to overdosing. You can't overdose really on vitamin D from full spectrum sunlight, assuming that you don't burn, obviously, and you avoid heat stroke and that stuff. But that's an important consideration. And then we also have to consider that there are many different vitamin D metabolites that come in different soluble forms. So it's not only a fat soluble vitamin or aka hormone, it's also a water soluble one. So when people say that infants can't get vitamin D from their mothers when they breastfeed, that's false. If the mother sunbathes, they can actually get those water soluble forms which then gets transferred into the baby. And I think there has to be up to like 25 plus different soluble forms of vitamin D in the body, which is something that mainstream medicine completely ignores. I mean, you're talking about this complete obsession with 25 hydroxy and just looking at that number. Is it low? Is it low? Is it high? Yes, that can tell us somewhat of a indicator of how much sun you get, but it by no means explains the entire story. It's definitely the tip of the iceberg.
That is super useful to know. Okay. So see, I've seen this go around for years. Yeah, that's such a common recommendation. If your vitamin D is low, take 2,000 IUs, 5,000 IUs, or 10,000 IUs. I've seen crazy stuff like take 50,000 IUs. Yeah, there's a I doubt the paper is valid, honestly, but like this circulates around like in the bro esoteric sphere. Supposedly guys took like 50,000 IUs a day for like, I don't know, 4 months, and like it made their dick grow. I'm like, I don't think that's true, honestly. I know everyone wants that to be true. I don't think that's true. You're probably this better off going outside and getting horny that way.
Yeah.
But okay, so vitamin D, so D3 as a supplement, utility wise, is just really not worth it. There's no utility there.
I'd say like maybe 96, 97% of the way completely useless and creates the risk of side effects. There may be a potential use case in terms of like if someone is super deficient, extremely deficient, sure, you can load them up on some IUs. But ultimately, I think it's just better for somebody to get out into the sun when UVB is out, because you're also going to get so many other benefits like infrared, blue for circadian signaling. Blue light has actually been shown to reduce adipocytes or fat cells, shrink them, and then also increase the rate at which they burn fat. So you can actually, get a little bit of body composition result from sunbathing. And so there's just so much on the table that I think people are leaving out there.
I think like the ultimate fat loss cardio, I'd say, would be, if you could do fasted morning cardio outside, shirtless.
Bar none.
Yeah.
The best.
So, what is your position on, let's say, like vitamin D lamps? Like you give a scenario, someone, they live in Alaska or close to the Arctic Circle. It's dark, for many months out of the year. Everyone's depressed. Like, are those lamps like worthwhile investment? Do they actually work? Or is a vitamin D lamp different from a tanning bed?
Vitamin D lamps, I think, generally are very different from a tanning bed because tanning beds are isolated UVA for the most part. I think they're like 95% UVA, 5% UVB, whereas the tanning lamps are like the Spurdy lamp, I think, is mostly UVB to actually produce the outcome of vitamin D3 production. So I do think they're effective to a certain degree. Again, it's a very slippery slope with isolated UV lamps, which is why I'd rather pair it with some sort of company that offers red and infrared in addition to that. Companies like Chroma or EMR Tech or Mitolux, those are good companies that kind of combine those wavelengths, which is at least better than isolated UV. But I think the broader point here is that the human body is a cyclical, seasonal creature that's built off of circadian protocol or principles. And so what do we know about melatonin and the relationship that it has with vitamin D3 is that melatonin is actually able to bind to the vitamin D receptor, which is very interesting because it tells us that we essentially want to maximize sun when it's sunny and get as much vitamin D3 stored into the body fatted system, especially in its different forms. And then during the wintertime, we want to rely on endogenous melatonin, meaning get that near infrared light outside during the day, spend as much time as you can outside during the day, and then make sure you get that darkness at night for the circulatory form. Because if you look at this relationship between melatonin and its ability to bind to the vitamin D receptor, it creates a lot of the same benefits that vitamin D3 does. And so it's creating this kind of seasonal and cyclical framework in our minds to where we can kind of change our relationship to the seasons, assuming that your location and latitude does actually allow that.
That's fascinating. Since that's a common, I guess you say, sort of a fear people have. Like if I live in a dark place, or if I live in a place where there's very defining seasons, and winter is not time to go outside, like am I still going to be sort of like circadian aligned? Yeah, even if it's dark and snowy most days.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really cool, by the way, because then we add in the layer of cold exposure, and I think cold exposure is very important from a circadian perspective. For circadian alignment, because cold is actually a Zeitgeber or an external circadian cue. Light's the most powerful one. You have food, temperature, social interactions are actually a Zeitgeber as well. But I think the real interesting aspect of this work when it comes to cold, and this ties into the work of Dr. Tom Seeger, is its relationship to biophoton production. If you expose yourself to cold, you produce more internal light from the metabolism of mitochondria. And so some of those biophotons from the mitochondria are found in the UV range, also found in the UVB range. And so the theory is that if you get cold, through whatever means, whether it's a cold shower or ice bath, whatever, then you produce these UVB biophotons, which then interact with sulfated cholesterol, which then allow you to maintain vitamin D3 stores at the very least, or even produce vitamin D3. So that's a crazy rabbit hole to get into as well.
Okay, no, that's super cool. I mean, I'm gonna oversimplify, but basically, if it's winter and you want to maintain circadian alignment, vitamin D levels, hormones, you need to get some cold exposure.
Especially if you're lighter skinned.
Mm-hmm. So what's your take? I mean, I'm just kind of, the ice bath, like the popularity of like cold, ice baths, cold plunging. How do you see that fitting into circadian health? Is that something that you recommend people do? Or is that, I don't know is that essential, non-essential, useful, cool? Like, what's your perspective on it?
I don't think it's essential per se. It is going to depend on the individual. So obviously N equals 1. But I think that if we look at cold exposure, especially for lighter skinned people, because darker skinned people, they thrive more so under full spectrum sunlight and higher UV. Whereas lighter skinned people, you think of like the Nordic countries or think of the Vikings when they're always in cold. That in and of itself is very important for their kind of haplotype and skin setup. By the mere fact that you're producing a lot of biophotons, but there's also a lot of other things going on in the background with cold exposure. If we look at mitochondria, they essentially act like Carnot heat engines. This is a very interesting concept, which means that the colder your external body gets, the hotter they run and the more efficient they become. And so cold exposure, I think, has a lot of implications for mitochondrial health in that sense, which of course has so many different effects. Outside of that, I think that, what else was I going to mention on that end? Yeah, I mean, the ice baths are not really necessary. If you live in a cold enough environment, you can take your shirt off, go out in shorts. So long as I think you're kind of getting those goosebumps on your skin barrier and also kind of having that gasp reflex to a certain degree, I think those are really the metrics that I like to look for. But either way, I think that's fascinating. And there's also an electromagnetic component to it because the human body is an electromagnetic system. And so when you study cold and, if we look at technology and how semiconductors work, they often put some semiconductors under cold conditions to make them more efficient.
Yeah.
The human body is honestly not that different because the colder we get, the more electromagnetically efficient we get because the body works on piezoelectricity, flexoelectricity, photoconduction, biological semiconduction. Again, incredible rabbit holes that are out there.
So, earlier this year, I kind of got into running, and let me preface that when I say got into running, I don't mean I'm training to run a marathon. I just started running more regularly just for overall health. But it was January. So I was in New Jersey. Temperature outside was probably like in the 20s, 30s. It was cold. It felt great. Like running in the cold, like I loved it. I felt like I had better endurance. Like I could go farther. It was really enjoyable. Now I'm in Texas, and it has not been that hot this year, but let's say it's in the 80s, 90s. Not nearly as enjoyable. You overheat, and every runner kind of knows, like you overheat faster, your endurance takes a hit. But the difference has been this, like again, and I'm a slow, like I'm not a competitor, I'm a slow casual runner. The difference is stark. I'm like, wow, like running in like cold or like sub-zero temperatures or sub-freezing, it's like this, almost like a supercharger. Then the hotter it gets, it's like the worse your performance gets.
Yeah, I mean, any exercise in the cold, I've had that experience as well. It's like it's invigorating compared to, or at least the better word is it's replenishing as opposed to running in a hotter environment or exercising in that kind of condition where it's definitely it diminishes your energy and I think makes you less likely to go on for longer time periods.
Yeah, definitely. That was something where, like I was running outside a lot and I was like really enjoying it. Then, during summertime, so if you hear, I'm like, I just prefer to be on the treadmill again. Like, I don't care about being standing tough. I'm like, I could run outside, it's 90 degrees, or I could go inside where it's 70 and the run feels better. And I'm not sweating, because obviously you sweat a lot more, right? And I'm not getting dehydrated faster. So.
And I do think that's in large part due to the fact that your mitochondria are making more ATP. It's just that you're making more energy. And so the system thrives off of that.
Gotcha. Okay. I knew there had to be something to it that was much more physiological. I didn't like deep dive on it.
Yeah.
But, okay. No.
You should get by the way, you should get Dr. Tom Seeger on. He's a fantastic follow in an individual.
No, I'll definitely get him on since I got his book actually
Okay.
recently. Yeah, and like the one like you see like the cold therapy, which that was really interesting, especially his point about prostate health specifically. Like that was just something I know that's something a lot of older guys, older clients I've worked with are always like very concerned with. Like making sure their PSA never goes above or below a certain level. Or maybe they had a dad or a grandpa died of prostate cancer. They want to not ever have that happen to them. Like what can they do?
Yeah. It's for me, I think, this also does horseshoe into kind of the chronic disease discussion because when it comes to circadian health and circadian alignment, I mean, there's no argument to be made. Chronic circadian disruption is directly causal of every chronic disease model we can find in society. I mean, we have literature showing that chronic circadian disruption causes cancer in human beings.
Mhm.
So, that gets into the skin cancer discussion and whatnot. We have research showing that isolated blue light in and of itself can increase blood sugar and insulin without food, independent of food. I think that plays into a real part with the POMC system, pro-opiomelanocortin system, things like peptide hormones like CLIP or ACTH, which kind of influence cortisol, and then that also tracks with blood sugar and insulin. So I think this is also important work from the perspective of battling chronic disease in the U.S. and worldwide, and I don't think that's something people really consider as well.
I mean, the point about light affecting blood sugar levels, that's super interesting because then you have to consider too, a lot of times people who are overweight, obese, metabolic syndrome, people eat inside. Like the majority, 99% of people, they eat all the meals inside. And if you're overweight, you're over-consuming calories, you're spiking insulin, what have you. You're under, let's say, constant blue light, no sunlight. So then it's not just the food that's having an effect on your metabolism. It's also the fact you're eating in your office or whatever, under the damn, where are the bulbs that everybody hates?
LEDs, fluorescence.
Yeah, fluorescent lights, like which again, I've hated since I was a kid. It feels weird. You're eating with fluorescent lights, whatever, you're eating hyperpalatable, fats and carbohydrates together. All of it contributes to the overall outcome. It's not just, that's not just the nutrients food itself. It is the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no problem saying, and I'll stand on this hill, I'll die on this hill. I think that I could turn a pre-diabetic, maybe even a type 2 diabetic, into someone who's metabolically healthy simply by changing their relationship with light, especially around food. Pre-diabetic for sure. I can definitely make that change. But I think that this also works in both directions. So isolated blue can definitely increase blood sugar and insulin, leading to insulin resistance to a certain degree. Obviously, food and sleep and other things play a fundamental role into that. I think it exacerbates that outcome. But red light from the sun actually reduces postprandial blood sugar by up to 27%. So this one study actually took a flashlight. It wasn't even full coverage of the individual's back or the participant's back, but they shined it on the back for around 15 minutes, I believe. This was like 630, 635 red light, nanometer specifically. And they saw up to a 27% reduction in postprandial blood sugar after that effect, which is not a small outcome by any means.
No.
So, you think about all the people who are eating inside. If we simply just move them outside and get more skin in the game, that can have a massive effect on the whole pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes epidemic.
No, that's huge. That's enormous. I mean, a simplified version of that, just if you eat your meals outside or are able to, that by itself could have incredible implications for this overall glucose management.
Yeah, and what is interesting about mitochondria is kind of like they almost view red and infrared, or they respond to light wavelengths kind of like a switch. So you don't have to stay out for like 15, 20 minutes to get that effect. I think if you stay out for even 5, 6, 7 minutes, you kind of send the signal to your mitochondria to respond in that way. And we also have to consider that everything around blood sugar and insulin is under circadian control too. So if you are chronically circadian disrupted, then you destroy, we talk about the pancreas, pancreatic cells, all that stuff is going to go out of whack. But if you're in circadian alignment, I think you open the door for just better outcomes in general.
No, absolutely. Yeah, like I forget where I read this years ago. It was somewhere in the circadian world, and it was like I read a lot of things, and it wasn't a paper. I think it was probably like an offhand comment in like a forum or something. But it was to the effect of if you actually wanted to gain weight, gain body weight, bulk up, and you want to do it as healthily as possible, the best time to do a bulk would be the summer, because metabolism will be at an all-time high, or the peak high because of the sun. Mitochondria will be running efficiently. Nutrient partitioning will be way better. And that's the time that you'd want to try to gain weight and do sort of like a clean bulk, sort of minimize fat gain, maximize muscle gain. And then winter would be arguably like the worst time, because then you have less light exposure, obviously, you're inside more, and now your gains are going to skew more towards body fat. And part of the premise with this was the fact that animals that live in these environments, bears, whatever, animals that hibernate or animals that try to store fat for the winter, summer is when they try to gain weight. They don't get skinny in summer and then bulk up in winter. They bulk up in summer, and then winter is their cut down season. I was like, that's interesting. And so I don't know any guys that have really done that. It's classically, obviously, summer is when you cut, winter's when you bulk. But I'm like, maybe that'd be worth trying.
It makes sense in my mind. I think that especially when you put the cold into the discussion with wintertime, because that alongside the other fundamentals will strip body fat like no other. And I would like to see somebody run that experiment. I'm sure Dr. Abud has run that experiment in the past, but we'll see.
Yeah, no, I'll have to ask him. I definitely want him to come on, but it'd be very N equals one. I don't know how you could, I don't know if you could ever stay that formally in a study. I'm like, all right, you have to basically track guys for like a year, right? Yeah, and you'd also need past comparison data of like, tell me how your past bulks went compared to this bulk. And nobody has that level of data, right? They can tell you probably their weight gain. I'm like, you'd be needing to track a number of things, but like, it's definitely an experiment. For anyone listening, if you want to try an experiment this year, let us know how it goes.
Yeah, and I will say it also ties into the whole nutrition discussion. So when it comes to circadian, I think these circadian changes over the summer and winter, we have to consider things like, the macronutrient breakdown of what you're eating. So if I think it's better to orient yourself around higher carb during the summer, because of the fact, like, if you think about foods at the equator, they're generally a lot sweeter. They have more sugar and carbohydrates. And if you also study deuterium as well, deuterium is basically like this heavy isotope or heavy form of hydrogen. It's very abundant in high carbohydrate foods. And so if you consume too much deuterium, because the body only wants it in specific places at a given amount, then you could actually potentially impact mitochondrial function through its ability to kind of break the electron transport chain of a single mitochondria. And so again, rabbit holes on rabbit holes, that stuff is very interesting that I think has practical applications too.
Talking about deuterium, since I saw this, probably about 2 or 3 years ago, deuterium depleted water, which was fucking expensive. Like, I mean, I didn't find it practical. It's something like all you have to do is to spend like $8-9 a bottle, and you can order like 40 bottles at once, and then you want deuterium depleted water for these reasons. I'm like, I don't think anyone's going to spend that much on water per month for bottles of water. And I'm a beverage guy. I'm like, that's shitloads of bottles of water. That said, I was like, it was interesting because I had never heard that before. That was a new thing to me. I'm like, okay, we don't want deuterium. We don't want an overload of deuterium. Talk about it.
Yeah, so I mean, we're talking about hydrogen here. So you have two really distinct forms of hydrogen in relation to human biology. So you have protium, which human biology loves. That's the light form of hydrogen. And then deuterium is really the heavier form of hydrogen. And I think the deuterium depleted water is, I think it's more therapeutic. So for people who are struggling with, potential cancers or something like that, I do think it's a really good idea to get on that kind of train, because there's quite a bit of research on deuterium depleted water in cancers. But in terms of its effect on the human body, we have to consider that it does track according to latitude. So if you're at the equator, you're going to have higher carbohydrate foods that have a lot more deuterium. For good reason, because sunlight actually depletes deuterium. So that's a free way. Sure. Sunbathing can deplete deuterium. And then if you go towards the higher latitude countries, you have lower deuterium. Like that's, higher latitude water is essentially deuterium depleted water. It's fantastic stuff. But if we're talking about a single mitochondrion and how it functions, you have the electron transport chain, which is made of 5 complexes. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, like, that electron transport chain loves protium, the light form of hydrogen. But when you throw too much deuterium into that system, because it's basically double the atomic mass of protium, it throws off the entire system because it's such an intricate process that requires such, I guess, perfection. And so if you do that over time, you basically destroy mitochondrial colonies, which can then lead to chronic disease. And so that's, I think, why processed food in particular is also very damaging to the human body over time, because of the fact that you're overloading deuterium, you're not getting sunlight, so you're not depleting it. You're not thinking about macronutrient breakdown or any of this other stuff. And for me, that's the essence of what we talk about when we talk about quantum biology. A lot of people hear that term and they think of it as like pseudoscience or bullshit, but that's a prime example of quantum biology at play.
So how do you define quantum biology for people who, let's say, they never heard before, and you're going to give a simple breakdown explanation?
I would essentially say it's the study of how physics and quantum mechanics relates to the human body. That's probably the most simple way I could break it down. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about electrons, protons, neutrons, and how those things tie into the biophysical perspective of the human body. Because if we look at like how, the human animal works, biochemistry is not that's not the bedrock of how it all works. At a deeper level, the relationship between physics and biology is really the deepest level that we can get to. And so that, I think, is one that mainstream medicine does not talk about or cover. And I think that's where we can see a lot of these circadian principles making a real change.
So yeah, that's interesting, because I think oftentimes when we are trying to study something, we're trying to break it down to these smaller pieces, we might have this belief that if we can reduce something down to like its parts, that becomes easier to understand. But often when you break things down to smaller pieces, it becomes more complex and more complicated.
Way more. I mean, just to give an example, I'll show, like, at the end of the electron transport chain, complex 5 is where you have a quantum electromagnetic rotor, for lack of a better word. It's literally a rotor called the ATP synthase. The ATP synthase, I mean, it's absolutely insane how it works, but I think it does like 6,000 RPMs per second. It's very sensitive to deuterium, but when you study biology at a deep enough level, it's essentially magic. And that's why I think there is definitely an aspect of divine intervention, and God definitely has his hands in all of this work, really.
So ATP synthase, talk about that a little bit, because I learned this years ago, and it's really fascinating to me, since we don't think of cells this way, but it's actually spinning.
Yeah, I mean, I might not be I might not explain it in the best way, but considering those five complexes, the most important complex that we'll think about here is really the complex 4 to begin with, and that's cytochrome C oxidase. And that's what really absorbs red and infrared in particular, because the electron transport chain has chromophores, or light sensing and absorbing molecules within every aspect of it. And so, complex 4 absorbs that red and infrared, shuttles protons into complex 5, which is ATP synthase, and that's what allows that rotor to spin more efficiently. And that's where I think we can get into issues if you're under chronic circadian disruption over time. But we need to understand that basically that entire electron transport chain is under circadian control. It's influenced by quantum mechanics. I mean, you have proton tunneling that occurs in this very sophisticated system that a lot of it often goes over my head, that I'm still learning about, but it is certainly magic in my mind.
No, I mean, that's the explanation. I think it's super cool, since I think many people could relate to the experience where maybe they go outside during the sun, they feel energized. You have the sort of elation that happens. You can tell there's this uptick in overall vitality, but like, what's actually happening, right? And I remember finding Dr. Cruz's work years ago, which can get very verbose very quickly. He's not always the best at, he's not, his area of expertise, it is not in explaining things simply, which is fine. Not everything needs to be simplified. But he was making this big long post about how internally in mitochondria, mitochondrial complexes, we have internal light, and these things are sensitive to light, and these lights are affecting those systems. And at the time, I had never, it's something you'd never thought about, right? When we study mitochondria, like in exercise science, they make ATP, creatine phosphate system, glycolytic system, glycolysis. At no point in time is it ever factor in like, hey, like what else affects this? Like, does light affect this? Does temperature affect this? Like, it's described, it's a system, but it's still described in isolation from anything else. And then, it's this showing his work. I'm like, oh, wow. Like, that sort of opened up a whole new frontier. I had never considered that before. And then, like what we just talked about, actually the past hour and a half of like light is, outside and in your body at all times, and it is affecting you on all levels.
Yeah, I feel like, the mainstream medicine certainly suffers from this kind of myopia when it comes to understanding mitochondria because of the fact that, like you said, they only explain certain aspects of how they work. But mitochondria are incredible. I mean, you're talking about a circadian controlled, electromagnetically driven organelle that not only is responsible for making some of your most important sex steroid hormones. Steroidogenesis is actually where the mitochondria, that happens in the mitochondria first and foremost, but it's also responsible for things like melanin production. Like if you don't have proper working mitochondrial colonies, then you don't have enough ATP to actually power or create pigmentation in the skin.
Hmm.
There's so many different things that are just incredible about these organelles. And even further to that point, if you look at the inner mitochondrial membrane, there's an electric charge. And that electric charge is around 150 to 200 millivolts. Not much if you study electromagnetism, but Professor Nick Lane talks about this. And he says that if you basically shrink down to that kind of scale, when you shrink down at the nanoscale, everything in biology becomes exponential. And so that 150 to 200 millivolts ends up becoming around, I think, the electric charge of a bolt of lightning. And so you have trillions of mitochondria that are producing the energy of a bolt of lightning essentially every second for, however long. And that kind of shit is just what blows my mind wide open. And it pushes me to study this work at a deeper level when it comes to biophysics as well.
That is super cool. The question I meant to ask this earlier. It's just, this is a step back from this, but this is a new technology. This is what I was trying to remember to ask this. But so obviously we have tanning beds, of course. We have like vitamin D lamps. Red light beds have become a thing like the past year. They're extremely expensive. Like I think a red light bed is anywhere from like $30,000, $40,000, $60,000. It's not something that I think most people are ever going to have in their house. But supposedly they have multiple health benefits. Is that something that you see having therapeutic use, like actual is worth it? Well, worth the investment, or is it more just like a niche sort of therapy? You go to a clinic, you do it a couple times. Like where would that factor into all this?
Just specifically with the red and infrared beds?
Yeah.
I think it definitely has therapeutic benefit. There's no doubt about that. I mean, if you study the literature, photobiomodulation is undeniable. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're talking about red and infrared light therapy for all kinds of things like removing wrinkles through the fact that it creates collagen, elastin, hyaluronic acid in the skin. You have the reduction of pain. You have, there was a study recently that I saw that showed that consistent red light therapy use in women who had hypothyroidism was able to, I think able to get half of them off of thyroid medication completely, which is just mind-bending to think about. And again, go down the list. You have sports performance stuff. You have the improvement in organ systems, creating circadian alignment. It's quite undeniable on that end. And so anything that allows us to get more red and infrared light therapy will have benefit. Now, obviously, it does follow kind of a U-shaped curve. So more is not always better. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to harm the individual or create any side effects. I do believe that most people in this day and age are starved of red and infrared, which means that if we can get that to them by any means, then we're going to do that.
So, like, a red light something that you recommend to people, like when you're working with them, like, hey, get a red light, or like I've seen all manner of recommendations. RLT shorthand, like red light therapy and rehabilitation has pretty robust evidence at this point. If you have, if you have a joint injury, if you tear an Achilles, if you had a broken bone, put that up against the skin like a red light, small, like a modular unit, leave it there 10, 15 minutes, do that like, every day, or, maybe like once every other day at EOD, and that will help the healing process. Yeah. How do you recommend them to be used?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my frontline recommendation. I think it's obviously there's no replacement for the sun, but I think it has a lot of use case for a lot of people in this day and age. And so as for how to be used, I think that, I want to stick with daytime use because during the night, I think the lux or light intensity off of those panels is intense enough potentially to stop pineal melatonin production, which needs darkness. So yeah, stick with the daytime. In terms of like time allotted, I think that like 15, 20 minutes max is probably something that's notable there. As close to the skin as possible generally. There is also the potential concern for magnetic fields, AC, alternative currents and all that stuff. But by and large, I think that if you use it close to the body, it should help. And I think the most simple way to explain its effect is that you're improving the mitochondria in the system, in any part of the system. So if you improve the mitochondria, you're going to improve function in that given part of the body. And there's even, I think it's also a use case for eyesight regeneration from a circadian perspective as well. So there's a lot to it, but I think that those are some good guidelines.
Oh, no, that's super useful. Since I get asked about that frequently. Obviously, red lights have taken off dramatically. And there's different companies that make them, of course. I know, like, Chroma is on X, obviously. They got, like, the handheld units, which are super powerful. But also, like, they're only meant to be used 60 seconds, right? Like, you can't hold that up to your skin for long periods of time. And, then you have, there's so many. I don't know if there's any one company that dominates, per se. I've seen green light therapy has become like sort of a novel treatment for migraines, which I don't get migraines, but I've heard anecdotally from people that was super powerful and that basically cured them. Not the issue. Yeah, I don't know if you have any insight on that, but
my theory on it, I haven't dug too deep on it, but I think it's impacting one of the opsins. I believe it's rhodopsin, which is actually responsible for sensing light in the blue-green range. And so my hunch is that maybe that connects to like the trigeminal nerve or something like that, which then influences headaches. But I think it influences the opsins big time. But I haven't even yet to try green light therapy, so I'll definitely have to do it.
Yeah, I haven't tried green light therapy either. Red light therapy panels. I have like a full body panel. I like some of the handheld panels. I like using it. Not something I do necessarily daily. You see, you get naked, you stand in front of it. It leaves you with a certain feeling, like cellularly. It's sort of like, some of you using, like, I'd say almost like a sauna. You go into sauna, you're in intense heat. If you come afterwards, you shower off, maybe you rehydrate, but you feel good.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And by the way, I think one use case where I think most people can use it, almost everybody really, is just to add more infrared and near infrared in the environment. I think that's a big one that we don't think about because if we're talking about indoor environments, those are environments that are inherently deficient in red and infrared by the mere nature of the lights that we use, which are just basically biased towards this isolated blue, and also the low emission windows, which actually filter out a substantial amount of the red and infrared if they're closed. So that's another use case in my mind. And you can also do that by other means. I mean, if you have incandescents, they're naturally emitting infrared, candles to some degree as well, fireplaces, but that's something that I think about too.
Yeah, on the subject of light bulbs. So I moved into a new house recently, and I went through the old houses, took out all the LEDs. I got bulbs from Healthflux. So it's a company in Finland. They still make incandescents. I had them shipped over. Yeah, there you go. Yes. Yeah, I had them shipped over. It took like 4 or 5 weeks. All the light bulbs in the house outside of, I think, maybe like the laundry room are incandescent bulbs. What is that? I know I'm sure you recommend incandescents, but like, where do you get yours from? Or like, if someone wants to like change their whole light environment, like, what would they do inside their house? Would it just be incandescent bulbs and that's it? Like, would you change the windows even? What would that look like?
Changing the windows, I mean, it's more of like a Ben Greenfield type of intervention. It requires a lot more cost, right? I think changing the bulbs is definitely something that most people can do with very little effort and very little cost, especially with incandescents. So I do actually get bulbs from Chromolux. I love them. They're a little bit more expensive. I mean, I don't think they're any different from regular incandescents that are cheaper. I do think the lighting might be a little bit more crisp and bright, but they're fantastic bulbs. They offer red incandescents too. And so if you can go through your home and just look for any like artificial light source that does basically any conventional lighting source out there will provide isolated blue only, you basically swap that out for an incandescent. And in terms of, I think a better light, incandescents are probably up there, but a better light is firelight. And so if you can get any of those two because of the fact that they provide a balanced spectrum of light, a lot of infrared, a lot of red, that's going to help facilitate a healthier light environment, especially at night, And then that will have second and third order impacts on sleep quality, muscle growth hormone spikes early on in the night, and just overall quality of life. I really can't think of anything more powerful than watching sunrise, progressively sunbathing during the day, and then making it very dark after nightfall.
That's the formula right there. Yeah, I mean, no, I wish I could use candles and I guess some sort of like I mean, you have to imagine historically everybody used candles or oil lamps, thing like that. But yeah, I guess we still could. It's not as practical per se. Obviously, the homes today are designed for light bulbs,
No.
but that would be a
Yeah.
cool change.
I've managed to kind of move mostly towards candles, but it is more expensive if you want to go down that route because there's another candle rabbit hole where you have to understand like non-toxic versus toxic. Big advocate of beeswax candles. Um, yeah, if you can find a way to get those, then those are fantastic for around the house too. Well, be careful around children, of course, because
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they would burn shit down really fast.
yeah, boys don't hesitate.
Yeah, no, my daughter too, probably more than my son. So I mean, this is a completely separate subject from circadian science, but you became a dad recently, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, my son Enzo's gonna turn 2 months this month actually,
How's
or
that?
2 years. Sorry.
How's it been?
It's been incredible. I mean, it's been definitely a complete shift in my life. You go from somebody who's single, you get a girlfriend, maybe long-term girlfriend, and then you either have a child first out of wedlock or you get married first. And that for me it's been an incredible experience that I've learned a lot about myself. It's created more responsibility on my shoulders, which I think has propelled me to earn more money and be more serious about my work. And ultimately, I think it's really the savior of Western civilization, really. The family unit, I think, is one of the most incredible things. And I've also learned about this from my family as well. Like my dad and how he related to my mom and having them take care of me. That's just priceless stuff.
Yeah, like I mean, this is not like a fatherhood podcast, but I always just like to ask guys since I like my kids are young, like they're 1, 3. I mean, your son is gonna be 2, but like the shift the shift in the evolution it has on you, it's so profound. You can't really put it fully into words. You're only gonna be trying to describe it, but it connects you to like the past and the present and the future in a way that is unmatched by anything.
You
I
know,
think about it all the time. Like I mean, for the first time in my life, once I became a dad, I really thought hard of like the long term outlook of like the world I live in, the society I live in, the environment I live in. Of like, oh, like you are going to create a world to come, and it will be your kids that inhabit it.
no.
So now everything that you do has that much more seriousness and that much more weight.
Yeah, every little decision I think gets placed under more scrutiny in your own mind. And I think it's almost like a mini death when you go from not having a child to having a child. And I think that to compare worldviews between not having children and having children is just it's a completely different worldview that I think adds a lot more to your experience of life. Because in my mind, when I was single and like I didn't have a child, I think that I would be more apt or more likely to fall into kind of like this wallow like sadness and you know yeah, I'm kind of struggling to explain it, but it would be very easy to get down on myself over some stupid shit too. But now like there's more responsibility and so there's none of that really that comes into my mind anymore.
Yeah, no, you described it well. I mean, when you're a father and when you're a husband and a father, you don't get to have bad days. And it's not just from fake toughness per se, but just from the fact that it puts into perspective all of life's problems. And what is problematic to a single person doesn't mean anything to a parent. Yeah. You realize how much your life is, but maybe not an overreaction, but it just the responsibility that you have on a day-to-day basis and needing to be present and needing to perform. The burden of no performance and like, knowing that people depend on you. So then, smaller minor things that might have thrown you off in your youth, they just don't mean anything anymore.
Mm. And for me, even my wife and my child is like that. That's the ultimate mirror of how I am acting, and that's the biggest like kick in the butt ever. Like when you consider that if your wife tells you something like you're not acting a proper way, or and this is of course not some like fucking simp manner or anything like that. Like you're not being a beta male. Like ultimately your wife does hold it down as much as you hold it down. And so you have to be very careful about how you act and what kind of quote unquote trauma or habits, more simply stated, you bring into that dynamic, because that has a real effect on not only your child, but also how that relationship ends up going for, 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, no, you see, obviously you have a son, but like you realize your children, and your wife, like all of their emotional regulation is just your emotional regulation.
Which is, that's so.
Yeah, it's really all, I mean, that's like, I think they're all is too. Like if you are a calm man and you have good self-control and you take care of problems, like you don't overreact, your family is probably going to be pretty happy.
Yeah.
Like this, just something like this, that by itself, like if you can just do that, like you will have a good life. If you are overreactive, if you get angry easily, if you, crumble under pressure, if you're high anxiety, high stress, then your wife and kids are always going to be reacting to you or modeling that, and things will not go well.
Mm. And it's all interconnected, If you're not aligned with circadian stuff, if your, nutrition's not on point, you're not getting enough sleep, all that stuff is going to bleed into everything else.
Yeah, no, I've actually slept really well since my kids were born. I probably sleep better now than I'm a dad than I ever slept as a single guy, because it forces me to actually legitimately, I didn't get circadian aligned until I had kids.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I was circadian aligned before just because of the nature of the work that I was involved in, but going to bed at 7:30 or 8 p.m., that's the best sleep ever.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was one of those guys where I would stay up till like 2 a.m. like for pretty much all my 20s. Yeah, even my wife, when she's my girlfriend, like I just stayed up late. I woke up late, right? Yeah, I never saw really a sunrise unless I've been out all night. Yeah, but now having kids is like, okay, like we're going to bed. By 9 o'clock, everything is wound down. I guess I'll go to bed too. But the adage of every hour before midnight is worth like 2 hours after midnight.
True.
If I'm saying it correctly, it's absolutely true. If you can fall asleep before midnight, not you fall asleep at 9. It also made me realize too that like if you read historical literature, people waking up at dawn or waking up at 4 a.m. I'm like, how the fuck did anyone do that? It's like, oh no, it actually makes sense. If you're just not on your laptop screen phone at 2 a.m. and you actually go to bed when it gets dark, you will in fact wake up probably around like 4 or 5 a.m. and you'll be well rested and you'll get up.
Yeah. And it does actually tie into the circadian alignment discussion because I think there was a study where they took participants and they basically had them go on a weekend camping trip. And they found out after about a few days that human beings naturally wake up at dawn. If you have the proper light and dark cycle and you're not exposing yourself to these artificial screens or, these artificial light spectrums, you naturally wake up around dawn and, you go to bed shortly after sunset. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, no, I've heard that many times with the years of people were same kind of experience. They go camping or they're outside a lot and they're probably away from EMF as well. They're not on their phone, and then everyone's sleep magically fixes itself after about a week.
Yeah, big shocker. Because like insomnia, waking up in the middle of the night to take a piss, like all that stuff it's abnormal. But people have kind of been conditioned to think it is normal these days. And there's all circadian explanations for all of it, but I think that's a very helpful thing because sleep is a very important part of health and just quality of life. Like if you want to feel like a normal human being and have, good performance in all areas, like you need to make sure your sleep is dialed in. And that's not, it hasn't become a meme just because like it's very, very important.
Yeah, and sleep, like I've been saying this now more recently, the past few months, for past year, like with clients and it's like for various groups that, yeah, if you're trying to talk about pillars of health, like oftentimes you have like sleep, nutrition, diet, exercise. And I put light first now. Like you have light, and then if your light environment is proper, your sleep just really happens by default.
Exactly.
You can't really separate those two things.
Exactly. That's a pretty profound insight because I think they're married, they're interconnected. And this whole talk of like sleep optimization and protocols and whatnot, I don't have any of that. I simply just follow circadian principles. And I shit you not, if I do track with my Aura ring, but I pretty routinely get at least 2 hours of REM and deep most nights, which is, top 1% sleep, assuming I do everything correctly. I do follow the 80-20 sort of prescription where most of the time I'm on point and dialed in. The rest of the time I choose not to give a shit and just live life. and kind of go into the more extreme end of the spectrum
Yeah.
to enjoy life to its maximal, I think that's important as well. But yeah, no thought of like, oh, I have to make sure the temperature is at a certain degree and I have to take this specific supplement stack and whatnot. It's all just very natural when you fall into circadian alignment.
Yeah, I mean, sleep supplements are obviously a huge market. There's lots of things people recommend take. There's a gazillion formulas that float around, whether it's obviously magnesium glycinate, lysenes, ginkgo. I mean, you could rattle stuff off. Yeah, I had like a Broscience biohacker group. And there's always people like, what do you guys take for sleep? And everyone's got a list of stuff they've tried. I'm always experimenting with something that's fun, but after trying all of them, like, yeah, if you're magnesium deficient, take magnesium. I don't think anything really makes much of an impact just beyond being in a dark room when it's dark and following that schedule. Everything else is a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's no supplement more powerful than watching sunrise, because you actually regenerate the melatonin cycle, meaning you make it easier for you to fall asleep. Okay, that's insomnia gone. And you make it more likely that you get deeper sleep. That means you're not going to wake up in the middle of the night. And then if you couple that with the darkness at night, you're not going to experience any of these other side effects. So for me, it just makes so much sense to just orient myself around sunrise instead of spending 100, 200, 300 bucks a month on whatever given supplement that is essentially a Band-Aid, like you mentioned. And it's a reductive approach to sleep as well.
No, that's what I mean. I want to say that's a good advice, but for everyone that's always searching for the solution, chemically speaking or nutraceutical or supplemental, you're not going to find. There's no sunrise in the bottle.
Yeah, that's a good quote. I should use that.
Awesome, brother. So my son's wondering what I'm doing. I'm talking almost 2 hours. I'm gonna get to my kids. So I told them I play them at 5. But to wrap up the conversation, we covered a lot. This is an awesome discussion. We covered a lot. Where can people find you? How can they work with you? Just lay out all the details.
At Zaid K Dahhaj on all major platforms. So ZaidKDahhaj. That's X, Substack. The Circadian Classroom on Substack is really good because it's more unique deep dives into like hyperpigmentation and whatnot. And then Instagram. And then also the 2 a.m. podcast is really fun. It's more of an eclectic conversation style. Hopefully we can get you on one day because we'd like to do it exclusively in person. And we talk about health, circadian stuff, a bunch of different subjects. And outside of that, if anybody wants to work with me, then Zaid K Dahhaj is basically my website tag. So yeah, all the information will be there and they can just DM me or something like that.
Very, very good. And then do you have any like big project stuff you're working on that's coming up, or a book, anything of that nature?
Not really. I do have a course called the 80/20 course.
Oh.
Definitely a circadian oriented course. I don't have a landing page or anything for that. Maybe I should. Maybe I should improve that, the marketing and all that stuff. It's not really my forte. But that's I think a really comprehensive thing that people can approach me for, and that'll explain all the simple the simple action steps, all the science, as comprehensive as you would want for the everyday average person. But other than that, just studying more deeper stuff in terms of this work, biophysics and all that, and then trying to like get this into the mainstream, because there's a lot of people who still believe in the mainstream narrative.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't know you had a course until right now. So
yeah, so I'll send it your way for free.
Yeah, no, 80/20 course. You just make a landing page for it.
Yeah, super simple.
Make a landing page. All right, cool. All right, thank you guys for listening. If you want Zaid back on, if you have questions, send me a message, let me know, and I will be talking to you all of you guys again. Adios, friends.
Thank you.